Okay, thanks everyone for joining me today for this webinar on Drupal 8 Multilingual. I'm going to try and cover a lot of the site building topics related to Drupal 8 Multilingual today. And I'll have time for questions at the end, so please let me know via the chat if you have questions, or you can wait till the end and I'll leave time. So just as an introduction, my name is Suzanne Dargachova. I work at Evolving Web. We're based in Montreal. And we're a Drupal development and consulting firm. And we also run a Drupal training program. So if you're interested in learning more about Drupal and Drupal 8 in particular, we have a bunch of trainings coming up in Montreal in August. In September, we'll be in Ottawa and in Toronto, and then in October we'll be in Chicago. And these trainings are week-long trainings that cover site building, theming, and module development. So to start off with, Drupal 8 Multilingual is really an exciting topic because Drupal 8 Multilingual is just so much easier than Drupal 7 Multilingual. So for those of you who are using Drupal 7 now and you're looking at upgrading, I think this is one of the main selling points, especially for site builders for Drupal 8. All of the work that we had to do in Drupal 7 to make a multilingual site, it often involved installing a lot of extra contributed modules, doing a lot of really specific configuration, and the configuration was really different for different types of translations and different types of components. And so in Drupal 8, things are just a lot more streamlined, and things work a lot more smoothly. So to start off with, even just when you're installing Drupal, you'll notice that language is just more built into Drupal 8. So when you're walking through the installer for any Drupal 8 site, you'll notice that the first step is to choose a language. So this allows you to install Drupal in a language other than English, and choosing a different language. At this stage, we'll actually download the translations for Drupal's user interface in the language you choose, and then you'll be able to proceed with the installation in that language. So if you, for example, decide to install your website in French, then the installer will continue in French. And you'll have all the translations available on localize.drupal.org for Drupal itself, and those will already be present on your site. So this installing Drupal in another language has a couple effects. First of all, the language and interface translation modules that are part of Drupal core will be installed right off the bat. So you don't have to go and install any extra modules, and those translations will be downloaded for you. So then you just have to go about setting up your website in that language. So this is a great option if you want a website in a language other than English. So a French-only website, a Spanish-only website, basically any monolingual website. And it's also a good option if you want to have many languages, but you want the default language to be something other than English. So you can start off with the website in whatever language you choose, and then you can add in other languages as you need. So for most of us, we're here because we want to have a website in multiple languages. So for this use case, we need a couple more modules. And if you go to the Extend page in Drupal 8, you'll see that there's 4 multilingual modules in Drupal core for Drupal 8. So things are really nicely divided into these 4 modules. So at its most core for a multilingual Drupal site, you need the language module. So you need this for either a website in a language other than English or a multilingual site. And this module allows you to install other languages on the site, so install multiple languages. It sets up a language switcher on the site. And then it's just a requirement for the other 3 translation modules. So the other 3 modules we see here, configuration translation, content translation, and interface translation. For a multilingual website, you'll want to enable all of these. And what this allows us to do is to translate the 3 main types of text that we have on any given Drupal site. So the 3 main types of text, we have user interface text. So these pieces of text, they're typically text that come with modules or themes. So text that's in Drupal code. So if you have a module that you've created and you've added some text to that module, the module is actually printing out text. That type of text is user interface text, and this we can translate through Drupal. And because often user interface text is common between Drupal websites, these types of text strings, you can import them from localize.drupal.org. And there's now integration in Drupal core between localize.drupal.org, the website, and your Drupal website. So just by adding all those multilingual modules and installing a new language, you'll be getting those translations from localize.drupal.org, and then you can override them if you want to customize them. So that's user interface text. Content, this is sort of the main thing we think about usually when we think about translating a website. So content in Drupal 8 actually applies to a lot more things than content in Drupal 7. So we have more things that are translatable by content translation. So things like menu items, blocks, taxonomy terms, nodes, of course. And then other types of entities are translatable as well. And then finally, we have configuration. So configuration in Drupal 8, it refers to configuration entities. So these are the configuration that you do as you're building the site. And sometimes it refers also to configuration that's in place when you install Drupal. So if you install your Drupal site and you already have the article content type set up, the name of that content type, the name of the fields for your content type, the name of the help, the text of the help text, and then any configuration that you're doing, like adding views, you're often adding text as part of this process, and all of that is part of configuration entities. And so these are all translatable through the configuration translation module, which you'll enable when you install Drupal, and you can translate them. I'll show you what the interface for that looks like. So I'll just go through this kind of more module by module. So when you install a Drupal 8 website and you've enabled these 4 modules, the one that's the most core is the language module, which allows you to install and configure different languages on your site. So this works largely like it did in Drupal 7. We have the ability to add languages really easily. We can pick from a list of many, many languages and install a language like that. And they'll all be listed on your website. So you'll have the list of languages and you can choose which one is the default language. After you've added languages to your site, one thing to check as part of your installation is how Drupal is figuring out which language to use when it's displaying a page. So as soon as you have more than one language on your site, every time Drupal displays the page, it has to decide which language to display everything in. And so by default in Drupal 8, the detection method that's used is the URL. So that means that Drupal is going to look at the path of your site. It's going to check if the language is specified in the path, either as a path prefix or as actually in the domain, if the language is part of the domain or domains, if you have a language-specific domain, it'll check that first. And then there's other detection methods that you can kind of use as a backup if the language isn't referenced in the URL. So for example, your default might be URL, and then you might have a backup to use browser detection. So Drupal will look at what language your browser is in and use that. And so if you want to have a fallback like that, then you can go ahead and enable that on the detection and selection page that I have showing here with the screenshot. So by default, if you're installing multiple languages on your site, every language that you're adding on, there's going to be a path prefix added for that language, and it's just going to use the language code. So for example, for French, the path prefix that's automatically going to get used is FR. If you want to have a path prefix for English, then you'll have to go and configure that under the detection and selection methods. So you'll go ahead and configure the URL detection method and add in whatever path prefixes you want. So this is also where you could change the path prefixes. For example, if you wanted your prefix for French to be FRA, then you could configure that here. So this is really configuring how Drupal's detecting the language, how the language is specified in the URL. And this is really like the standard way to do it. That's what the default is. But of course, if you wanted to go, you could go to this configuration page and switch it over to use the domain instead of a path prefix. And that would work as well. It just requires a little bit more configuration on the server side to get domains pointing at the right place. So that's just the overall language setup. And then once you have that kind of figured out, you'll be looking at translating the different components of Drupal. So the user interface, the content, and the configuration. For the interface translation, these again are pieces of text that come with Drupal modules and themes. You can import and export these using PO files, or you can translate them manually through the website. And in Drupal 8, the interface for translating the user interface text, it's similar to what we had in Drupal 7. There's a search UI, but you can translate multiple strings at once. So if you have the same piece of text appearing multiple times in different strings, then you can just search for that text and do all your translations at once. So for example, if I search for home, I might find home and homepage, and then I could actually fill in the translation for both of them. And this is a technique you can use for just adding translations for your own custom modules and themes, and also for overriding translations that come from localize.drupal.org. So as I mentioned, when you're installing a new language on the site, any translations that are available for the code that you have on your site, that's going to be imported automatically from localize.drupal.org. And localize.drupal.org is a website where community translations take place. So there's a sort of team of translators for each language, and they're working on translating Drupal core and also contributed modules. So you can take advantage of this automatic import. You don't have to manually download the files and import them. But you could, if you wanted to download the files and then alter them and then import them, you could do that as well if you wanted to override a lot of the translations. So that's going to provide basically the translated user interface. Now, a lot of the user interface strings are actually part of the admin UI, so you might not be so worried about translating each and every user interface text, depending on the use case of your site. If all of your editors are speaking one language, then you just want to make sure that the translations are there for that language. So for example, if you have 9 languages on your site, you might not need the user interface text translations for all of those languages, or you might not worry so much about getting a complete set of translations. What you are probably more worried about is getting all of your content translated. And this is usually a major effort for putting any website online in multiple languages. The nice thing about Drupal 8 is that more things are part of content. So when you go to the configuration settings for content translation, you'll see that it's not just nodes that are there. It's not just standard content types that we think of as content. There's also a lot of other things that you'll find there, like users, taxonomy terms, blocks, menu items, comments. You'll also find things like paragraphs if you're using the paragraphs module. It's a module that adds these kind of compound fields or sub-content types. And so it's like a different kind of content component on your site. And you can also translate those with content translation. And that's going to apply to a lot of new types of entities that you're adding to your site. So if you're adding new modules that add new entities that are content, then you'll want to come back to this page and you'll want to make sure that you have translation enabled for the things that should be translatable. So this interface, it allows you to choose which types of entities should be translatable. Like here we have selected content and taxonomy terms. And so content in this case refers to nodes. And just by selecting that checkbox, a list of all the node types or content types will appear below on the page, and you can choose which ones should be translatable. So you don't have to go and configure each content type one by one to make it translatable. You just have this one interface. And then below each content type, you can see here in the screenshot that there's a list of all the fields for that content type. Fields and translatable properties, so things like the title, the author, the publication date, things like that. And they're all listed below for each content type, and then you can check off which ones should be translatable. So this isn't the page that we come to, the content translation page. It's not where we do the translation, it's where we set up what is translatable. And at first you might think, well, everything should be translatable because I have a multilingual website. But you might have some types of fields that are kind of language neutral, or that you just won't have translations for. And so this interface allows you to pick and choose which ones to make translatable. So for example, you might have user-added content, user-generated content, and you might not have translations for that because you're not expecting users to translate their own content or any translations to be added for that. Or you might have bloggers on your site who are publishing blog posts, but only in their own language, and you don't expect those to be translated. And then for individual fields, you might select to make the field translatable or not. And so for different types of fields, it'll be a different choice. For images, for example, you might want to just have one image that's the same across languages, but you might want to make the associated text for the image, like the alt text or the title text, you might want to make that translatable. So that's an option under your content translation settings as well. Images are broken down into separate components here, so you can make the right component translatable. For other types of fields also, you might select to make things not translatable. So for a date field, for example, if you're having an event and you need to translate the event content, you probably don't need the date to be translatable because the date's going to be the same whether you're speaking English or speaking French or speaking whatever other language you have on your site. And then other fields that are that don't involve language, like for example, if you're linking your events to Eventbrite and you have an Eventbrite ID, that's not going to be translatable either, unless you've set up a separate Eventbrite event in English and French, or in whatever languages you have. So this interface really allows you to pick and choose what is translatable. And so when we're looking at Drupal, 7, there were different options for how to translate content. We could translate nodes using the content translation module, or we could translate fields like we do here in Drupal 8 using the entity translation module. So now in Drupal 8, there's just this one way to do things. And when you're creating content and translating content, there is, for nodes, there's only one node, regardless of how many languages you add. And then the content is translated at the level of fields, as you see here. And you can choose which fields in particular are translatable. Also in this content translation page, you have access to the translation settings for each content type. So you can choose what the default language is going to be. So by setting up content translation like this, you'll see whenever you're creating content that you'll have a translate tab to add the translations once you've entered the content. And the translate tab gives you an overview of all the translations you have for your piece of content, and then it gives you a link to add a translation if one doesn't exist. So for example, here we have an English piece of content, and you can translate it into French by clicking the add link here. So this is, again, very similar to what we have in Drupal 7. The nice thing is that because content translation applies to so many things, this same interface is going to appear throughout your site for different types of translatable content, like blocks, menu items, taxonomy terms, any of these things will have this translate tab. And then actually adding the content translation is going to look something like this. So you'll see the text in the original language filled in, and then you can replace that with your translation. And then certain fields that aren't translatable will be displayed, but they'll be marked so that you know that that particular field is not language specific. So like I said, this content translation concept applies to not just your typical nodes, but also to things like custom blocks and taxonomy terms. So back on your content translation page, you can also turn on translation for these other content entities. So for example, for any Drupal site, when you install it, it's going to have a basic block type. This is for the standard block you think of that has a title and a body. And so you'll be able to make these fields translatable. So the block description is the title actually of the block, and then the body is going to be the main text of the block. So you can set up translation for blocks just like you would for your different content types. In Drupal 8, though, we have block types built into core. And so you can add different types of blocks on your site with different fields. And you can see how with this interface, it's not just a matter of turning on translation for blocks overall. You can actually turn on translation for different fields. So if you have another type of block that displays videos, maybe the video part of the block is not translatable, but the title of the block is. So you can control, again, the different settings for each field using this content translation interface. And then once you've configured the custom blocks to be translatable, then it's just a matter of going into the blocks interface, adding a custom block, and you'll see the link to translate it, just like you would for a node. And then taxonomy terms work in a similar way, so you can choose on a per vocabulary basis which terms should be translatable. So if you have tags on your site or categories, you can decide which of those is translatable. And then for fields within your taxonomy terms, you can turn translation on and off. So typically for predefined vocabularies, like categories that you decide up front what your categories are going to be, you'll probably want to turn translation on. So the process will be adding the taxonomy terms and then translating them, and then the authors come and create the content and tag the content. But if you have more of a free tagging vocabulary, like tags, you might want to turn translation off for that, because typically when authors are going in and creating content and tagging content, if they're adding a new taxonomy term on the fly, they're probably not going to turn around and translate it. So you can kind of make the call on which vocabulary should be translatable. And then for menu items we don't usually think of as content, but when you think about it, it does kind of make sense. Usually when you're launching your site, you'll have all your configuration in place, but menu items are more something that you'll add on a regular basis, depending on your site. And so menu items are treated as content entities, and so you can make them translatable using that content translation interface. And then when you go to add a menu item, you can choose whether you want to make it translatable, and then you can go in and add a translation like you would for any other content entity. And finally, we have configuration translation. So user interface text, remember that was part of our code and our modules and themes. Content are things like nodes and blocks and taxonomy terms. And then configuration applies to other types of text, other types of configuration that you're doing as you're setting up your site. So this applies to things like menu, the names of your menus, the settings for your content types, things like the name of your content type, the name of different fields, the help text, the configuration of your views. So often in views, you'll be configuring title, more link, extra text just as part of those settings. And then things like your site name. So things that were variables in Drupal 7 are now all part of configuration. So if you go into the configuration translation part of your site, this is under configuration, regional, and language, you'll find this page. And at first it's kind of overwhelming. It's just this big list of Drupal things like contact forms, content fields, content types, and there's a list linked to next to each one. And basically this list link gives you access to translate any configuration entity that falls within the category you see here. So if you click on content fields, if you click list, you'll just see a list of all the fields on the site. And if you translate it, you'll be able to translate the information associated with that field. So the interface, when you click translate, is going to look something like this. And you'll be able to add a translation for each language. So some configuration entities are simple, like the site name here, it's just a simple string. But other types of configuration entities are more complex. If you think about views doesn't just have one piece of text you're associating with it. There's many different labels and pieces of text that you might add in the process of setting up a view. And so when you translate a view, you'll see all these different subcomponents that you can expand and translate individual items. So the interface is a little bit overwhelming sometimes, just like the views interface. But if you drill down far enough, you can find all the bits of text and add the appropriate translations. When speaking of views, so when you're setting up a view, you can choose the language to use when you're configuring the view. And then you can also choose what language should be used when the view is being rendered. So typically, if you're displaying a view on a page and it's displaying a list of content, you'll want the content to appear in the interface language that's being used to display the page. So you can select that would be a good default. Or if you want something more specific, like you want a view that just displays content in a certain language, or you want the view to display all the content regardless of language, then you can choose a different option. So that kind of sums up the three categories of things we can translate in Drupal 8 and the kind of interface we have for doing the translation. There's also one other feature I just wanted to mention that people would always ask about in Drupal 7 was how they, especially for websites with many languages, when you're switching around doing translation, often the language of the site would change and it would display the administration interface in a language that the administrator didn't understand. And so now each user on the site, in their account, they have a site language option, so they can choose which language should be used to display the admin interface. And so this just makes it easier to administer a website in a language we don't understand. So finally, so we talked a lot about configuration, but I just wanted to also highlight how to make our websites translatable when it comes to writing code. So one big change in Drupal 8 is that we have Twig templates as part of our themes. And so when you're adding any text to your template files, you just need to make sure that that's translatable. And there's actually two ways to do that in Twig. You can use this T filter, which you see here is the first example. So the text home is made translatable just by passing it through this T filter. And those double curly brackets just mean that that variable is going to get printed out. So the home text will be printed out, and if needed, it'll be translated. And then the other option is to use trans and ntrans tags. So these curly bracket with a %, this syntax sort of indicates that you're going into Twig's code mode. And so here there's sort of this block that we're creating that's translatable text. So the text by, author, on date will become translatable. And those variables will just be displayed as tokens in the translatable string. So it's we don't have to worry about using the T function or creating an array in our template files. It's really easy to make a translatable string. In PHP, the syntax for creating a translatable string is the same. So we're using the T function. And if we have variables, we can pass those in an array to the T function as well. And then in JavaScript, we can also use the same interface to make our text translatable. So pretty straightforward. And we just have to make sure that we're loading Drupal.js. So whenever you're setting up wherever you're adding your JavaScript, you just want to make sure that that file is being added. So today, this is really an overview of the features in Drupal 8 and everything that you can do through configuration. But if you're more curious about how things work under sort of behind the scenes, there's a lot more information that you can find on Drupal.org. Also, Gabor Hotzi has a very good set of articles about multilingual Drupal. He, of course, is the lead of the Drupal 8 Multilingual Initiative, which was a really fantastic initiative to bring all these features into Drupal 8 core. And so you can find out more on his blog. It's a really excellent set of articles that go more in depth. And then there's kind of a fun website, Drupal8multilingual.org, that you can also check out to see an overview of the features, and they have a little video. If you're looking for some step-by-step instructions on just setting up your Drupal 8 multilingual site, there's also a link here to a handout that's been used for a bunch of Drupal 8 multilingual trainings, and so you can refer to that as well. And finally, if you want to come to an in-person training where we can talk more about Drupal 8 Multilingual, you can come to one of the Evolving Web training sessions we have coming up and learn more about Drupal 8 in general. So I just wanted to see if anyone has any questions. There's a Q&A panel as part of the webinar interface, so you can add your questions there or in the chat. I'll give a couple minutes if anyone thinks of anything. Otherwise, I have tried to record this session, so I'm going to send out an email with a link to the recording. And there should also be another webinar like this coming up in about a month. So if you have ideas for webinar topics, feel free to email me. Okay, what's replacing string translation? I'm not sure exactly what you mean. So the method of translating the user interface, like via a module, it's really similar to Drupal 7. So I think when I think of string translation, at least in Drupal 7, I think of this interface here. Where is it? I think of this interface here for translating user interface text. So this is largely the same. So you can search for any string that's added in code, and you'll be able to find the original source string, which is always in English because the text we add in code is always in English, and then you can add the translation in whatever language. Any other questions? So I really encourage you all. I know that for some of you, you're not going to have a chance to upgrade your site to Drupal 8 just yet. It's probably a work in progress, but I really encourage you to go and try downloading Drupal 8. Maybe set up an account on Pantheon or use Acquia Dev Desktop or whatever tool you're using. Just set up a Drupal 8 site and check out some of these tools. I think you'll find it really exciting, especially if you've tried Multilingual for Drupal 7, and it'll just get you in the habit of trying out these new features, maybe trying out some of the new modules that are available for Drupal 8, and then when you're actually ready to build your Drupal 8 site or to upgrade your site, you'll be all set to go. So thanks everyone for attending, and I'll see you hopefully at the next webinar.